So before I get started, I went to culinary school, and for over a decade I cooked in restaurants ranging from greaseball pizza places to Michelin star-winning institutions. I'm also a white person, so I do think I'm kind of qualified to talk about this subject. Some of the knowledge I've accumulated about food over the years certainly is useful in this conversation. So, why don't white people season their food? The obvious answer is there weren't spices where white people come from. And while true, that leaves out a few hundred years of explanation. Indeed, there are about 1,000 caveats and pieces of context that all add up to the modern day white people don't season their food mantra. This mantra is not altogether wrong. I am walking proof of that, and I've cooked professionally a lot. If we consider seasoning to be anything outside of salt and pepper, I rarely cook with seasoning. That includes spice blends, seasoned salt, or just spices in general. Now, if you stick with me, I will explain why white people don't season our food, and why I, as a former chef, don't really season my food either. So let's get to it. The first thing we need to do is identify who these white people are and what this unseasoned food is. I mean, Italians are usually considered white, but I don't think anyone would accuse them of having bland or unseasoned food, so we do need to specify. When people say white people don't season their food, they're usually talking about white people from the northwestern, or maybe eastern parts of the continent. Of course, many of the first European immigrants to America were from those places. This food that's unseasoned is often the cuisine of those areas: Germany, Scandinavia, England, etc. So maybe to make a more accurate and more revealing version of the trope, we should really say Americans with Northern and Eastern European heritage don't season the food they make from their respective cultures. It's a lot wordier, but we're getting closer to a real explanation. A very, very incomplete one, but it is a start. There is a theory that says pre-modern people in hot climates used spices to cover up the taste spoiled meat. This theory states that meat spoils in these regions faster, so people would just douse their meat in spices to make it palatable. The theory extends this idea to modern times, saying that's why those cultures use spices in their cuisine. This is a racist, condescending theory that has no basis in reality. In recent years, it has been largely rejected. You see, when you eat rotten meat, you get sick and you die. Spices would not change that. And these people were not dumb. They knew how to survive. If people in India or Africa or Central South America had just poured spices all over rotten food and eaten it, they would all be dead. Today, there would be no civilizations in those areas. So as we go forward, we will be leaving that theory behind. In truth, the simplest explanation for white people not seasoning their food is what grows where. For pre-modern people, that determined your diet. Spices come from plants. In Northern Europe, it's cold and dark. There just aren't many plants that can grow in these conditions, so there weren't many spices. If you go somewhere warmer, sunnier, you will see a lot more plant life, so a lot more spices. Although this whole situation happened hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago, it has left cultural imprints in these regions. People cook things their parents cook, who cooked things their parents cooked, and so on and so on and so on. This is a nice, tidy explanation, but since pre-modern times, there have been a lot of other factors that have kept spices out of so-called white people food. Eventually, trade routes began to open up across Europe and Asia. Along these trade routes, spices traveled across China and India and North Africa and the Mediterranean and the Balkans and Spain. But you will notice that none of these places are in Northern Europe. This region was cold, dark, and really far out of the way. As a result, the common people in Northern Europe were still unexposed to spices. They just kept eating their potatoes and butter and lamb. But the European elite could send servants out on huge journeys to fetch these exotic spices. It was enormously expensive, but doable for the rich, powerful, and royal. Rich people in medieval Europe would have these lavish dinners with highly spiced food as a way to flaunt their wealth. Eventually, European countries started going out and colonizing places that did have spices. More trade routes opened and spices began free-flowing in and out of places like England and France. Spices got easier and easier to access. So for the rich and powerful, spices suddenly became uncool. They weren't rare anymore, so they weren't interesting to status-crazed rich people. Instead, European cookery began to focus more on butter, herbs, and meat-based sauces. This new sensibility, sometimes referred to as nouvelle cuisine, said that food should taste like itself. Nouvelle cuisine dictated that you get the freshest, highest quality product you can and highlight its natural flavor. The idea was that any seasoning should just serve to amplify flavor of the product itself. Bold spices would distract from this beautiful piece of fish or beef or lamb or whatever. I don't think this is inherently wrong, but it does require a huge amount of privilege. Finding extraordinary ingredients and treating them well is a great way to cook, provided you can afford those ingredients and you have the time, knowledge, and resources to cook this way. I think it's no coincidence that the places where a lot of this spice-free food comes from have historically been very wealthy. I would say that this is still a pretty relevant factor today. So up to this point, I've stuck to factual information rather than opinion. But as someone who does know a lot about food, I feel compelled to offer my own theories and thoughts on this whole issue. First and foremost, I think it's good that European, French, nouvelle cuisine, whatever, is not the only relevant approach to food today. More spices, more variety, more voices in the culinary landscape is undoubtedly a good thing. Everyone should get a seat at the table, and I think food today is closer to that than it ever has been. Now, I would push back against the idea that a lack of spices means food is bland, however. A forest mushroom and smoked sausage stew from Northern Europe, cooked for a few hours, is absolutely bursting with flavor. A German roast sauerbraten with its sticky sweet gravy, very, very far from bland. But I will admit that often European food cooked in American households is very bland. This is not the fault of the cuisine, but the fault of the people cooking it. I've studied and cooked a lot of food in pretty high-level establishments. All of those years have led me to one resounding conclusion. Home cooks don't use enough salt. I would even say this is my core culinary belief. When used correctly, salt doesn't make things taste salty, it makes them more flavorful. And the amount of flavor you can get from a single ingredient using just salt is a lot higher than most people would believe. Really though, there are a lot of ways you can put flavor into a dish. Spices are a great way to do that, but they are just one of many methods. Vinegar, lemons, great butter, fresh herbs, onions, garlic, these all have a lot of flavor. After all, a lot of spices are just these things dried and ground up. Ingredients themselves can have a lot of flavor too when handled well. The method you use to cook an ingredient can determine how much flavor it has. I personally enjoy relying on these things rather than spices. I don't think it's any better or worse than enjoying big, bold spices. It's just personal preference. See, food is not as simple as more spices equals more flavor equals more good. People consume foods for a number of different reasons. Some people have identities within food. Some may enjoy a dish because it reminds them of their family. It may help them feel like part of a specific culture. There are also social or economic reasons that people eat what they do. Growing up, I ate a lot of fish cakes. Not because they were delicious, but because they were nutritious, cheap, and easy for my single mother to make. Today, fish cakes are one of my favorite meals for a whole lot of reasons, flavor being just one of them. And I don't think that heavily spicing my fish cakes would make them objectively better in any way. This is to say there are a lot of different reasons people like a given food, outside of how it tastes. And then on top of that, different people enjoy different flavors. There's quite literally no accounting for taste. And even more importantly, there's no right way to cook your food. Ultimately, I think the whole white people don't season their food thing is mostly a joke. white people are kind of the butt of the joke, and that's okay. After brutally colonizing the world, I think we can kind of just shut up and let people have their fun. It's not really worth anyone getting too upset about, especially considering that it's often true. I've had some pretty bland casseroles in my day. But people are always asking why white people don't season their food. So, now you know.